Well, those who study the history of the early church will know that among the remarkable theologians of the early church is a man named Gregory Nazianzus, a very key person in hammering out what we call the doctrine of the Trinity. And on one occasion, Gregory was asked the question that after knowing Christ, what was the best thing in the Christian life? And he had one word, and he said it was friends. And one of the delights over the past years is to make the friendship of our next speaker, Dr. Kevin Flatt. Dr. Flatt serves as the chair of history, political science, and international affairs at Redeemer University College in Ancaster. He's the author of a number of important articles and a very key book. There might be more than one book that you've written, but the one that I know is the story of the United Church in the 20th century. The way in which after the union of the Methodists and Presbyterians, who I talked a little bit about in the last hour, there was a very significant story that took place. It's a very, very important event as he will unfold some of that story in the history of this province. He's going to come and speak to us on the Christian heritage of Canada in the 20th century.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haken, for those words of introduction, and thank you as well to Principal Wellham and to the Seminary for inviting me here to speak this evening. It's very good to be here with you, and not only to have the chance to speak, but also to worship God together. And being among God's people and singing His praises is a good thing to be doing on this Friday evening with all of you. Well, as Dr. Haken said at the beginning of his talk, we're here celebrating a number of auspicious anniversaries. 500 years since the Reformation, 150 years since the Confederation of Canada, and of course 90 years of this seminary, Toronto Baptist Seminary, and I'm glad to be able to contribute to that. So my topic tonight, as Dr. Haken said, is Christianity in Canada in the 20th century, and while this is not quite as gargantuan a topic as the one that Dr. Haken tackled for us earlier this evening, it's still a big topic. And the way I'm going to focus my remarks tonight is to address the developments in the Protestant churches in Canada in the 20th century, mostly since World War I. And I'm going to focus on the enormous changes that were experienced by the Protestant churches in this country during that period. What was at stake in these changes, I would argue, was nothing less than whether there would continue to be a faithful voice for the gospel in this northern dominion. So to bring this story into focus, I'm going to look at the two main branches of Protestantism in Canada in this period. First, we'll look at the mainline Protestant churches, which once dominated English Canada, and this will pick up and continue much of the story that Dr. Haken laid out earlier. And really we'll look at how they underwent a slow motion collapse over the course of the 20th century. Then we'll look at the evangelical churches outside of mainline Protestantism, which went from being fairly small churches on the margins to the new vital core of Canadian Protestantism. And finally, I'll ask the question, so what? What has this meant for the character of Canada as a whole? What have these changes meant for us now that we're entering or in the early decades of the 21st century? My argument in brief is that while the mainline churches largely abandoned their heritage and thus their role as the standard bearer for the gospel in Canada, the newer evangelical churches thankfully took up that standard and became the new core of Protestantism in this country. And so in God's providence, the gospel was not left without a witness in Canada. Nevertheless, the new evangelical core did not enjoy as wide a reach as its predecessors, as that 70% of the Canadian population, or the population of Ontario rather, that sat under the teaching of an evangelical pastor, as Dr. Haken said earlier. And Canada as a whole still lost a number of things in the transition. And on top of this, the new role of the evangelical churches came with new temptations and new dangers. And so we're going to look at those. So, mainline Protestantism and evangelicalism outside of the mainline Protestant churches. Those are our two foci this evening. So let's begin then with mainline Protestantism. By mainline Protestantism, I'm referring to those churches which held the allegiance of the large majority of Protestants in the first half of the 20th century. We can include three denominations in this category. In order of size, they were first, the United Church of Canada, which Dr. Haken didn't talk about because it didn't exist in the 19th century. The United Church was established in 1925 by a merger of all of the Methodist churches in Canada. That's what happened to all of those Methodists that Dr. Haken was talking about. All of the Congregationalist churches, and the Congregationalists were a fairly small denomination, and about 2/3 of the Presbyterian churches. So the United Church, 1925, Methodists, about 2/3 of the Presbyterians, and Congregationalists, which was a fairly small group. The second denomination in the mainline category was the Anglican Church of Canada, which had formerly been known as the Church of England in Canada. And the third denomination was the Presbyterian Church in Canada, sometimes known after 1925 as the Continuing Presbyterians, because they're the Presbyterians who stayed out of the United Church. In fact, there were many years of legal wrangling between the United Church of Canada and the Continuing Presbyterians over whether the Presbyterians would be allowed to continue to use the name Presbyterian Church in Canada. Early in the century, these three denominations, the United, Anglican, and Presbyterian churches, absolutely dominated the religious scene in the English-speaking parts of the country. In the 1931 census, for example, I also have some statistics for you. In the 1931 census, for example, 44% of the Canadian population claimed to belong to one of these three churches, meaning that they commanded the allegiance of an impressive 82% of all of the Protestants in Canada. So more than 4 out of 5 Protestants in Canada belonged to one of these three denominations in 1931. 4 decades later, in the 1971 census, nearly 4 out of 5 Protestants still indicated Anglican, Presbyterian, or United as their denomination. Mainline is therefore a fitting label for these three churches over most of the 20th century. So to get a sense of the massive changes that were experienced by these churches over the course of the century, it's helpful to think in terms of three major transitions. Somewhat like a good sermon or a good high school essay, I have 3 points, although I do have 3 points for both the mainline Protestant churches and the evangelical churches. So if you're looking forward to hearing me conclude after my third point, I'm afraid you're going to have to wait for 3 more after that. But 3 points for the mainline Protestants, 3 major transitions. First, from evangelical inheritance to liberal novelty. Second, from mainline to sideline. And third, from conscience of the establishment to acolytes of the progressive movement. Let's examine each of these transitions in turn. So first, from evangelical inheritance to liberal novelty. What do I mean by evangelical inheritance? Well, in the first place, I mean that all 3 of these denominations, including here the precursors to the United Church, had previously been committed to historic Orthodox Christianity, to the core convictions of the Protestant Reformation, and to the values of the evangelical revivals of the 18th century, such as the importance of a living personal faith in Jesus Christ and the urgent need to spread the gospel through missions and evangelistic preaching. Now, what happened over the course of the 20th century is that all 3 layers of this evangelical faith were abandoned by the mainline Protestant churches in favor of something called liberalism or modernism. Liberalism denied the central doctrines of evangelical faith, or redefined them beyond recognition. In place of scriptures that were God-breathed and therefore authoritative, liberals believed in a Bible that merely recorded the fallible religious ideas of primitive men. In place of a virgin-born, miracle-performing, crucified and resurrected Jesus. They believed in a Jesus who was conceived in the ordinary way, who provided merely psychological healing, and who had only risen from the dead in a metaphorical sense. As you can see, liberalism was not just a denial of this or that doctrine, but in fact an entirely different worldview from Orthodox Christianity. In fact, as the great American Presbyterian J. Gresham Machen argued, liberalism was not really Christianity at all, but a different religion that happened to be using much of the same terminology as evangelicalism. This rival religion of liberalism found its way into Canadian seminaries and pulpits in the later 19th century due to a number of factors, and we don't have time to explore this in detail this evening, but a brief list. Immense cultural pressures among the highly educated, the duplicity of professors and pastors who claimed to assent to creeds and confessions they actually denied, and the complacency of church leaders who failed to fight false teaching. These are just some of the reasons for the triumph of liberalism in higher theological education in Canada. By the time of World War I, liberalism had captured the governing structures of the Methodist and Presbyterian churches, and to a lesser degree of the Anglican Church as well. Now, we need to keep in mind that the transition from evangelicalism to liberalism was a top-down process that took many decades to play out. The older evangelical faith continued to live in the hearts of many clergy well into the middle part of the 20th century, and in the hearts of many lay people for a couple of decades beyond that. As I have shown in my book on the United Church that Dr. Haken referred to, and it is, in fact, my only book, Dr. Haken, so you didn't miss one. I'm working hopefully on another one, but that's the only one so far. As I've shown in that book, many of the theological changes took place only gradually, and they took place behind the scenes, such that only people in high leadership positions were fully aware of what was going on. While this was happening, there were lots of outward signs that evangelicalism was alive and well in the mainline, right into the middle of the century. Dr. Haken referred to the Evangelistic Crusades that became an important part of Methodism late in the 19th century. Well, that continued not only into the first quarter of the 20th century, but it continued into the 1930s, into the 1940s, even into the 1950s. This was still a major feature of life in the United Church. These crusades were the recipient of large amounts of energy, of time, of money. They were complete with altar calls, challenging people to commit their lives to Christ. Indeed, as late as the 1950s, the American evangelist Billy Graham conducted crusades in Canada which received widespread official support from United Church ministers and local bodies, even though some of these same church leaders and commentators expressed reservations about aspects of his theology. Not very many people, even into the 1950s, thought to ask exactly what United Church leaders meant when they used phrases like commit one's life to Christ. And in fact, they didn't mean what their evangelical forebears had meant in the 19th century. But it all looked very much like the old evangelicalism, and it was still just possible to feel at home as an evangelical in the United Church if you did not look too closely at the things being taught in the colleges or at the publications that were coming from church headquarters. This process also happened, although more slowly and less thoroughly, in the other two mainline denominations. The Anglican attachment to tradition helped impede the impact of liberalism for a while, and the Presbyterians who rejected union in 1925 tended to have a more conservative temperament than those who joined the United Church, although this did not always mean more conservative theology. In the end, however, liberalism ended up exercising great influence among Canada's Anglicans and Presbyterians as well, especially after World War II. But for all three churches, the really crucial decade was the 1960s, and I'm going to mention the 1960s a number of times tonight. In those years, liberalism assumed a position of open dominance in the United and Anglican churches and made a strong comeback among the Presbyterians as well. In the time we have, it's impossible to fully do justice to the extent of the changes that occurred in the 60s, but it's worth considering some of the main developments. First, a new, more virulent strain of liberal theology emerged internationally, associated with names like Tillich, Bultmann, A.T. Robinson, and something called the Death of God movement. It received a warm welcome from United and Anglican leaders in Canada. The Anglican establishment, for example, commissioned the prominent journalist Pierre Burton, and that's a name that will be familiar to many of you, to write a book criticizing the Protestant churches as frankly as possible. To put him on the right track, Ernest Harrison, who was an official at the Anglican Department of Religious Education, gave Burton a copy of radical theologian A.T. Robinson's book, Honest to God, which was a religious bestseller of the early 1960s, with the idea that this would inspire Burton to mount a critique of the churches based on this radical liberal theology. And this hope panned out. Burton's book, which was known as The Comfortable Pew, published in 1965, became a runaway bestseller by Canadian standards, and it drew heavily on Robinson's ideas in castigating the churches for their outmoded attachment to what he called dogma and mythological beliefs. The United Church was somewhat jealous that the Anglicans had beat them to the punch in getting Pierre Burton to criticize them. And so they tried to create a sequel to this by commissioning its own volume of critical essays the following year, complete with an essay by Pierre Burton, so they could demonstrate they could be just as self-critical as the Anglicans. Liberal theology was nothing new, but these developments went further than previous waves of liberal thought, and they played out much more publicly than those quiet, gradual developments I mentioned earlier. The United Church, for example, broke with tradition and created a Sunday school curriculum with the explicit aim of undermining belief in the literal truth of the Bible. In July 1964, Canadians were startled by headlines in the major newspapers revealing that the United Church's new curriculum questioned the historical reality of the virgin birth, the creation account, Noah's Ark, the Israelite crossing of the Red Sea, and even the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. The curriculum even managed to retell the account of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness without once mentioning the devil, which, if you think about it, is actually very difficult to do. You have to use the passive voice a lot. And this, of course, reflected the fact that the authors of those two books of the new curriculum just didn't believe in the devil. They didn't believe he existed. In fact, in one of the new curriculum books, the crossing of the Red Sea, instead of God parting the sea so that the Israelites could cross safely on dry land, the authors of this book suggested that, in fact, God had just led the Israelites through a marshy area, and the Egyptians' chariots had gotten stuck. And one commentator, I think quite rightly remarked that then the real miracle was that God had drowned the Egyptian army in ankle-deep water. Because of the curriculum, liberal theology became inescapable for ordinary United Church members and their children, unless, of course, they left the church. I'll say more about that later on. Meanwhile, the churches also softened or reversed their positions on matters of morality. Without confidence in the Bible, the creeds, the confessions, or the traditions of the church, they found it impossible to resist the pull of the sexual revolution that was beginning to take hold in Canada in the 1960s. Increasingly, United and Anglican leaders and clergy gave up on the idea that sex was only permitted within marriage. There was even one United Church director of pastoral counseling based in Toronto, a guy named Mervyn Dickinson, who was even quoted in the press saying that an extramarital affair could be, quote, a beautiful and constructive relationship, end quote. Later on, the PR people at the United Church claimed that he'd been misquoted, and so they had him write an article in the United Church Observer in which he basically reaffirmed everything that the newspapers had said that he had said. The United Church's official bodies not only dropped their opposition to abortion, which was still illegal in Canada up until the late 1960s, but under the leadership of a guy named J.R. Hord, who is the secretary of their Board of Evangelism and Social Service, they strenuously lobbied the government to make it widely legally available. I remember one of the most depressing days I had over at the United Church Archives, which used to be housed at Emmanuel College, not far from here. was the day that I spent looking over the briefs that the United Church presented to the federal government, urging them to make abortion as widely available as possible in the name of Christianity. The impact of these changes on the United Church, the most liberal of these three denominations, can perhaps be summed up by this observation. The church leaders who had enthusiastically supported Billy Graham and strenuously opposed abortion in the 1950s, in the 1960s, enthusiastically supported abortion and strenuously opposed Billy Graham. Many Anglicans were not far behind, and although the Presbyterians did not move nearly as far in this direction as the United and Anglican churches, the pages of the Presbyterian record in these years show that they were influenced by many of these same trends as well. In fact, the 1960s set the tone for mainline Protestantism for the rest of the century. Although there were important new developments, such as the gradual acceptance of homosexuality in the 1980s, in first the United and then the Anglican churches, these developments really followed the same trajectory that had already been set in the 60s. Despite resistance in some quarters, especially among conservative or evangelical Presbyterians and Anglicans, who could look for inspiration to their more orthodox counterparts in other countries, unlike in the case in the United Church, which doesn't exist outside of Canada, mainline Protestantism as a whole exchanged its evangelical heritage for liberal novelty. This brings me to the second major transition, from mainline to sideline. In all three mainline Protestant churches, this theological liberalization was followed by numerical decline and social irrelevance. As I mentioned earlier, in 1931, 4 out of 5 Protestants in Canada, and close to half the population as a whole, identified with the United, Anglican, or Presbyterian churches. With their services, Sunday schools, and revival and temperance and educational campaigns, they really had the character of a mass movement, playing an important, even a central role in the formation of the values of English Canadian society. Over the following decades, however, the influence and size of these churches dwindled. The decline began, you guessed it, in the 1960s, when all three denominations reached their peak number of members and began to lose more people than they were adding. Over the remainder of the century, each denomination lost about 40% of its members, during a period of time in which the Canadian population increased by 53%. Thus, by the 2001 census, the census that began the 21st century, only about 1 in 6 Canadians told census takers that they belonged to one of these churches, compared again to about 1 in 3 Canadians, nearly 3 in 6 Canadians back in 1931. This amounted to a huge loss in market share. And as striking as these figures are, they actually mask the true extent of the decline, because people continued to call themselves Anglican or United on the census long after they stopped actually attending church and gave up their membership. For example, to use the 2001 census as an example, of the 2.8 million Canadians who told the census takers that they belonged to the United Church, less than a quarter were actually members of the United Church, and only a tenth attended worship on an average Sunday. On top of this, by the end of the century, mainline Protestants gave less money per capita to church causes and volunteered less than adherents of any other major religious group. In other words, the remaining support of these churches was relatively soft. With a decline in numbers and funds comes, of course, also a decline in social influence. There's a very interesting episode in the early 1980s when the government of Pierre Elliott Trudeau was considering adopting what became the new Canadian Constitution. And they were debating whether or not they should include a reference to God in the preamble to the Constitution, which in fact happened, the preamble to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the Prime Minister at that time, who had a very secular outlook, particularly on politics, as Dr. Haken mentioned earlier, was himself wavering. He initially was opposed to including a reference to God. The thing that changed his mind was he looked at the submissions received from the evangelical Protestant bodies who had said that we should include a reference to God. And he had received information showing the number of evangelical Protestants training for pastoral ministry compared to the number of mainline Protestants training for pastoral ministry. And the mainline Protestants had been pretty lukewarm about this question about whether God should be mentioned. And based on the number of people training for ministry, Trudeau concluded the future of Protestantism lay with the evangelicals, not with the mainline. And so largely on that basis, he decided that his government would support an inclusion of a mention of God in the preamble to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this indicates, as I said earlier, that the main line really had become the sideline. This brings me to the third transition, which is the changing role of mainline Protestantism in Canadian society from attempting to serve as the conscience of the establishment to becoming what I'm calling acolytes of progressive activists. Through the first half of the 20th century, in the English-speaking parts of the country at least, mainline Protestantism was interwoven with most social institutions. Public schools at that time were, in effect, mainline Protestant schools, with an ethos and a religious curriculum that reflected mainline Protestant preferences. You may perhaps have asked yourself, why is it that we in Ontario, and in fact in many parts of the country, have a separate Catholic school board? Why is there a Catholic school board and a public school board? Well, it's because the public schools used to be the Protestant schools. They used to be, in effect, the mainline Protestant schools. Also, the leading English-speaking universities had been founded by mainline Protestant churches. And both denominationally controlled and not denominational universities were dominated by what Catherine Gidney calls a liberal Protestant establishment right through the middle part of the century. Protestant politicians tended to belong to one of these churches. All of Canada's prime ministers in the first half of the century, for example, apart from the two prime ministers who were Catholics, Sir Wilfrid Laurier and Louis Saint Laurent, were affiliated, however loosely, with either the Anglican, Presbyterian, or United churches. Social life, especially in small towns and rural areas, tended to revolve around the mainline Protestant church halls or basements. Moreover, these churches saw themselves as the guardians of society's moral values. In the words of W.J. Gallagher, chairman of the United Church's Board of Evangelism and Social Service in the late 1930s, the church was a, quote, colony of heaven, with a mandate to exercise a heavenly influence throughout Canadian society and its institutions. This included a self-appointed role as a moral authority and watchdog. All three of these denominations regularly provided advice, usually unsolicited advice, to federal and provincial and city governments about the kinds of laws and policies that would make for a more upright country. The role of the mainline churches as a conscience of the establishment collapsed in a particular decade, and you can guess which decade I'm going to mention, the 1960s, and the following decades for several reasons. One reason was the numerical decline I've already discussed. Another closely related reason was the increasing secularization of public institutions, including the universities, government itself, and eventually the public schools. Incidentally, I figured this out. I belong to the last generation of Ontarians that was still allowed to say the Lord's Prayer in public school. I distinctly remember that my grade 2 teacher at Forest Hill Public School in Kitchener still had to say the Lord's Prayer every morning at the beginning of the day, which was already quite unusual at that time, but it became illegal the following year to do that. In sum, the establishment institutions no longer belonged to the mainline Protestant churches the way they had in the early part of the century. But another reason that the mainline churches lost their role as a colony of heaven in society is that they stopped believing that they should play that role. Instead, a new generation of mainline leaders in the 1960s saw the church as part of the problem and took their cues instead from radical progressive movements led by secular activists. The main role of the church in society as they saw it was to get out of the way and to get on board with where society was going. And while they were at it, to apologize for having taken so long to do so. On issue after issue, the mainline churches adopted progressive political and social causes, most tellingly in the area of gender and sexuality. Indeed, the agencies of these churches often found themselves in the last part of the century ahead of the curve on causes like feminism, abortion, and gay marriage. In a play on the old British joke that the Church of England was the Tory party at prayer, some Canadian quipped that the United Church had become the NDP at prayer. I actually haven't been able to find out where that comes from originally. It's sort of a proverbial thing that people say. If anyone knows, perhaps Dr. Haken knows, if anybody knows where that came from, I'd be very curious. So, the mainline churches that began the century, trying to act as the conscience of the establishment, and in fact the conscience of the nation, as leaders of opinion, ended the century as devoted followers of the secular zeitgeist, cheering along left-wing and progressive movements from a largely irrelevant position on the sidelines. Okay, so those are my first 3 points. 3 more to go. Having discussed the changes in the mainline Protestant churches, I'm now going to turn my attention to the remaining evangelical churches, that is, groups outside of the mainline churches that still adhered to basic historic orthodoxy, the core claims of the Protestant Reformation, and an evangelical emphasis on a living personal relationship with Jesus. Who were these evangelicals? Well, as Bob Birkinshaw points out in his book Pilgrims in Lotus Land, which I highly recommend, it's an excellent study of conservative Protestantism in British Columbia. In the 20th century, the backbone of the Canadian evangelical movement outside of the mainline denominations was made up of 2 groups, Baptists and Pentecostals. The Baptists were the oldest and most well-established of the continuing evangelical groups in Canada, and they could claim this heritage because the Methodists had largely abandoned it. So much so that in certain times and places, some Baptists could even be considered part of the mainline. But there were always enough consistently and even militantly evangelical Baptists that it's hard to fit them comfortably into the mainline camp. And so a representative denomination here would be the Fellowship of Evangelical Baptist Churches, for example. The other part of the Canadian evangelical backbone of the 20th century was the Pentecostal, and by extension we might say the independent charismatic churches. These were actually the newest component of Canadian evangelicalism, having emerged as a distinct group only in the early 20th century. But they enjoyed very rapid growth to the point that their leading denomination, the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, became the largest evangelical denomination in Canada by the latter part of the 20th century. The Pentecostals, together with similar independent charismatic churches, carried forward the piety and much of the theology of John Wesley, early Methodism, and the holiness movement, with, of course, their own added emphasis on what they believed were the miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit, especially speaking in tongues. Alongside the Baptists and Pentecostals were several other distinct groups. 2 of the more important were, on the one hand, certain Mennonite churches, such as the Mennonite Brethren, who had adopted evangelical characteristics, often under the influence of Wesleyanism, and on the other hand, certain Dutch Reformed churches, who were theologically orthodox Protestants with their own evangelical traits, going back to 18th century revivals in the Netherlands. The Christian Reformed Church is a good example of this latter group. When I came into the building earlier this evening, someone greeted me and said, "You're from Redeemer, that Christian Reformed school." And I said, well, it's actually an interdenominational school that was founded by Christian Reformed people, and I'm actually a Baptist, and they somehow let me in. Disappointingly, I'm not even Dutch. But nevertheless, I'm at Redeemer. So the 2 other groups, in addition to Baptists and Pentecostals, that made up a lot of evangelicals, the evangelical Mennonites, evangelical Reformed folks. There were also evangelical groups that didn't really fit into one of these 4 families, such as the Christian and Missionary Alliance, for example. But most evangelical groups in Canada did fit into one of those categories. Considered as a whole, these non-mainline evangelicals also went through 3 transitions. Okay, so this is my second set of 3 points. 3 transitions over the course of the 20th century. First, from separate streams to overlapping consensus. Second, from Protestant fringe to Protestant center. And third, from acknowledged outsiders to aspiring insiders. And so we'll look at each of these in turn. The first evangelical transformation was from separate streams to overlapping consensus. Now, obviously, for those of you who really know anything about church history or theology, there were substantial theological and other differences between the various groups that I've mentioned. Some of them held to an Arminian understanding of soteriology, others to a Reformed or Calvinist understanding. Some practiced believers' baptism, others infant baptism. Some believed that the so-called sign gifts, like healing in tongues, were still active today, while others believed they had ceased earlier in church history. There were also important cultural differences. Both the Mennonites and the Reformed churches, for example, tended to be set apart by their experience of immigration and ethnic distinctiveness. On an everyday level, perhaps even more important than these theological and cultural differences, were differing rules about personal behavior that functioned as shibboleths to tell who was in and who was out. A useful thought experiment is to imagine a Sunday somewhere in Toronto around 1955. Now, this is a totally unscientific, quasi-historical exercise, but I want you to imagine a Sunday morning somewhere in Toronto, 1955. Imagine that there's a Baptist church, and a few blocks down the road there's a Christian Reformed church, okay? And they have their services at the same time, let's say. Both of them have just finished their services, and the people are milling about outside the church. Some Baptist families pile into their car, perhaps they're cramming into some tiny car, a whole bunch of them, and they drive down the street past the CRC church, the Christian Reformed church. And they kind of look out the window as they drive by the Christian Reformed church, and they see a bunch of men standing on the front steps of the church. And what are they doing? And if I ask this question at Redeemer, people would probably know the answer. Yeah, some of you know. They're smoking, right? They haven't been able to smoke for a while. They've been in a church service. They're coming out. Now they're having their smoke on the front steps of the church, which would have been quite normal in a Christian Reformed church at that time. So the Baptists, they drive by, they see this. They think to themselves, these guys, once they finish their cigarettes, they're probably going to go home and they're going to have a beer with their lunch, which, yes, they probably were going to do that. And so they think to themselves, these Reformed folks seem like pretty decent people, but they really have a problem with personal holiness. Now, the Reformed folks, for their part, watch the Baptists drive by. They're like, okay, those are the Baptists coming by in their car. They watch the Baptists go a little bit further down the street, and then they pull into the parking lot of the newly opened Swiss Chalet restaurant. And I checked, Swiss Chalet did begin operations in Toronto in 1954 with their very first location at the corner of Bedford and Bloor. Now, what are the Reformed folks thinking? Well, they're looking at this and they're thinking, those Baptists seem like decent people, but they really have a problem with observing the Sabbath. I've even heard that they only have 2 services on a Sunday instead of 3, which was the typical practice at Christian Reformed churches at that time. Now, there's a serious point to all of this, which is that as late as the 1950s, there was a certain amount of distance and at times even suspicion between these various different streams of evangelicalism in Canada, often based on these kinds of boundary markers in addition to the more serious theological differences. Over time, however, in the second half of the century, this sense of distance was replaced with a growing recognition that what Baptists, Pentecostals, Evangelical Mennonites, Reformed Christians, and other evangelicals had in common. Although there were multiple reasons for this change, the main reason I would argue is what was happening outside of evangelicalism. As we have seen, beginning in the 1960s, mainline Protestantism rapidly began to collapse, doctrinally and numerically. And around the same time, something similar happened to Catholicism, especially in Quebec. Canadian culture in general rapidly secularized from the 1960s onward, resulting in a more materialistic and hedonistic society, less friendly to Orthodox Christianity, especially in the area of sexual morality. In light of these changes, the differences between evangelical groups began to seem less significant. In the 1930s, say, you could look around, and most Canadians paid at least lip service to the importance of God and the Bible and Jesus Christ and Christian morality. Not so in the 1970s. If a Baptist, for example, looked around in the 1970s and asked, who is still willing to take a stand for belief in God, in the authority of the Bible, in the lordship of Jesus Christ, and in the sanctity of marriage, who would he notice but Pentecostals and Charismatics, Mennonite Brethren, and Christian Reformed folks? An important marker of this growing sense of evangelical solidarity was the foundation of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, or EFC, in 1964. Starting with the persistent work of Pentecostal pastor Harry Flatt, who tried to promote cooperation among evangelical pastors in Toronto, the EFC gradually grew to include most evangelical denominations by the end of the century. Now, there continue to be important differences between evangelicals, and in some groups, particularly in the Mennonite and Reformed worlds, many people didn't really think of themselves as part of a larger evangelical movement at all. Nevertheless, by the end of the century, there was a greater sense of shared evangelical identity based on an overlapping consensus around core convictions, and, just as importantly, a wider gulf between evangelicals as a group and mainstream society. So that's the first change. The second evangelical transformation was from Protestant fringe to Protestant center. Early in the century, non-mainline evangelicals were on the fringes of Protestantism, numerically and in terms of their relation to the larger society. Adherents of evangelical churches were vastly outnumbered by adherents of the Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches. Most evangelical denominations were small and not nearly as well known to the average Canadian as the big mainline churches. In fact, as Rick Heemstra, a friend of mine who's the director of research at the EFC, has shown, up until 1971, most evangelical groups were small enough and unfamiliar enough to census takers that they were not reported in the census data at all. In fact, several small evangelical denominations were routinely and intentionally reclassified by census takers who assumed they must belong to the United Church. They must have been one of those churches that was part of the United Church, and the people answering the census questionnaire just didn't know that. And so there's a whole bunch of smaller evangelical groups that just kind of disappear in the census data in the middle part of the 20th century. This is just one of many reasons, by the way, why Canadian census data on religion, at least in the 20th century, should be used with great caution, especially when it comes to counting evangelicals. Despite their small size, however, these evangelical groups outside the mainline were extraordinarily active, building churches and Sunday schools, Bible colleges, parachurch ministries of all kinds and descriptions. Just to take one example, an organization called the Canadian Sunday School Mission is a great example of this sort of activity. As a non-denominational ministry run by conservative evangelicals, it provided Sunday school teaching, prayer meetings, and Bible memorization contests for children in rural parts of Western Canada who lacked access to any evangelical church. This Canadian Sunday School Mission was so active that the United Church started keeping tabs on it. I've seen the file in the United Church archives. They started watching this group because they were concerned about sheep stealing of the competition they were getting from the Canadian Sunday School Mission. They thought of it as being somewhat shady. I'm not sure they were right about that. Throughout the century, evangelical groups were also growing quickly, keeping up with or even exceeding the rate of growth of the Canadian population as a whole. They continued to grow even after the 1960s, when mainline churches went into decline. Reginald Bibby, who some of you may have heard of, he's a well-known sociologist of religion in Canada. He and I have had a number of arguments about this. He says evangelicals didn't really grow over the course of the 20th century, but it's because he's looking at census data rather than actual data from the churches on membership and attendance and so on. So I'm happy to keep arguing with him about that. To give a few examples, between 1960 and 2000, the membership of the Fellowship of Evangelical Baptist Churches and the Mennonite Brethren more than doubled, while the number of persons served by the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, which is the closest thing they have to a membership figure, nearly tripled. Yes, the number of people in the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada between 1960 and 2000 tripled. Growth came from the defection of evangelicals from the mainline churches like the United Church. This is one place where people went when they were fleeing the new curriculum in the United Church. It also came from immigration. Evangelicals did a better job than mainline Protestants of working among new immigrants to Canada. It also came from higher birth rates and better retention of children. And of course, it came as well from conversion of the unchurched. Contrary to the predictions of Pierre Burton and other members of the liberal intelligentsia, Christian groups that stuck with their beliefs and refused to join the bandwagon of cultural change could, in fact, survive and even thrive in an increasingly secular Canada. It's important to note that the numerical growth of evangelical churches was not simply an amassing of nominal adherents either. Data from the latter part of the century shows that self-identified evangelicals had consistently the highest levels of commitment to Christian beliefs, church attendance, giving, and volunteering, and of all major religious groups in Canada, had personal moral views and behavior that were closest to biblical standards and furthest from the national norm. Now, they still fell short of biblical standards in important ways. But this shows that evangelical numerical growth was not just some kind of flash in the pan, but a real solid accomplishment. Because it took place while the mainline Protestants were suffering catastrophic numerical losses, these formerly marginal evangelical groups actually came to surpass them as the largest active component of Canadian Protestantism by the end of the century. As Bob Birkinshaw put it, by the 1980s, evangelicals were the, quote, worshiping majority in Protestantism, end quote. In other words, on the typical Sunday, there were now more Protestants worshiping in evangelical churches than in mainline ones. By Rick Heemstra's count, in 2001, the combined Sunday attendance of evangelical churches in Canada was about 1.1 million people, compared to only about 700,000 for the mainline Protestant churches. Now, my math may not be as good as Dr. Haken's, but it seems to me that 1.1 million is more than 700,000. The change was so great that some observers questioned, as perhaps some of you are doing in your minds right now, whether the label mainline even still made sense for the mainline Protestant churches. As one United Church historian put it, the mainstream had now become a very small dribble. In any event, non-mainline evangelicalism, which had been on the fringes, was now the vital core of Canadian Protestantism. The third and final evangelical transformation was from acknowledged outsiders to aspiring insiders. For most of the century, evangelicals in Canada were on the outside looking in. Compared to mainliners, they had practically no influence on the major social institutions, the halls of political power, or the centers of cultural production. Many evangelicals were recent immigrants, or were from less respectable backgrounds with less money and less education than were typical in mainline circles. Many were defectors from the mainline denominations. All of them knew that they were different from the mainline. Even in the first half of the century, when the liberalization of the mainline churches was less advanced and less apparent, evangelicals still saw themselves as different from the mainline. Not only did evangelicals outside the mainline see themselves as different, but by and large, and this is a crucial point, they were content to be different. They accepted their status as outsiders. They didn't expect the approval of the wider society, even though it was nominally Christian to an extent that's actually difficult for us to imagine today. They certainly didn't expect to be able to shape the dominant values of the country to align with their own. Indeed, they saw benefit in having a degree of separation from the culture and values of the wider society, as a guard against worldliness, even in a time before widespread open rejection of Christianity. This acceptance of outsider status could be seen in many ways. One was the formation of evangelical parachurch organizations that were intentionally set up as alternatives to the mainline Protestant options. A good example is the Canadian Sunday School mission that I mentioned earlier. Another indication of evangelicals' awareness and acceptance of their outsider status can be seen in the area of education. Some groups, especially among the Mennonites and Reformed churches, even established and funded their own faith-based day schools to educate their children. This is at a time when the public schools included prayers and Bible teaching in the curriculum. They still thought something was lacking in the public schools. In the area of higher education, evangelicals established Bible colleges and seminaries as alternatives to the older theological colleges and divinity schools that were being influenced by liberalism. And of course, this school, Toronto Baptist Seminary, is a great example of this, as is more generally the whole ministry of T.T. Shields, whose picture hangs outside in the lobby. These kinds of decisions involved huge sacrifice, financial and otherwise, from what were still usually quite small evangelical movements. Just as importantly, they involved a willingness to live with the stigma of being outsiders. Evangelicals' willingness to be on the outside looking in, however, diminished over the course of the second half of the century. Their growth in size, educational attainment, and financial resources gave rise to a new confidence. Their new status as the worshiping majority in Protestantism, coupled with the evaporation of mainline Protestant influence, gave rise also to a new sense of responsibility. Theological arguments that evangelicals should care about and become involved in public issues, particularly coming from American thinkers like Carl Henry and Francis Schaeffer, gained a heightened sense of urgency from the social and legal changes that began to undermine the sanctity of life, the integrity of marriage, and fundamental religious freedoms in this country. By the 1980s, Canadian evangelicals, both as individuals and through their institutions, such as the EFC, were less content to sit on the sidelines in the face of social and political change. Instead of accepting perpetual outsider status, they were applying for membership in responsible society and a seat at the decision-making table. Now, there was a great deal of merit in this course. It's hard to argue against evangelicals' desire to be a voice for biblical values in a world that was losing its moral compass, to speak up for religious freedom when it was threatened, or more generally to take some responsibility for a society in which they were now the second or third largest religious grouping, depending on how you count. An increased emphasis on public engagement and social responsibility was also the logical extension of the institution building that evangelicals had been doing in their previous generations. This trend had culminated in the area of education with the development of Christian universities with a broad curriculum, such as Trinity Western University, which was founded in 1962, and my own Redeemer University College, which was established in 1982. And these new universities, which really were filling the vacuum that had been left by the secularization of the mainstream universities, needed to obtain accreditation. They needed to obtain degree-granting powers. Much of this, again, it needs to be said, was good and necessary. But the transformation from contented outsider to applicant for a seat at the table was also fraught with temptations. And I'll return to those temptations in a few moments. Now, I realize I've badly misled you by saying I had 3 points and then 3 points. Well, I actually have one last section here, which is implications and conclusions. What did this all mean for Canada, for the state of affairs in Canada at the end of the 20th century? This part is short. Beginning with mainline Protestantism, it's clear on the one hand that its collapse has been a grave loss for the country. In the 19th century, as Dr. Haken talked about, and the early 20th century, the teaching of the mainline Protestant churches, whether from the pulpit or in the Sunday school or through their various campaigns, did a great deal to maintain a certain kind of moral climate in English Canada, largely rooted in biblical norms. This is the era of Toronto the Good. The relatively decent, polite, law-abiding, honest, neighborly character of English Canadian culture through much of the 20th century, often remarked upon by visitors, was funded by the moral capital built up by a century or more of mainline Protestant teaching and discipline. Although this culture had its serious historical blemishes, one thinks, for example, of the residential school system, as all human cultures do, they all have these historical blemishes. And although it often lacked clarity on crucial gospel issues, it was still a genuine accomplishment. The decline of mainline Protestantism has therefore been a major reason for the moral hollowing out of English Canadian culture. Much of our society is now using up what's left of this moral capital without replacing it. Moreover, and in this company this point is perhaps so obvious that it hardly bears saying, the abandonment by the mainline churches of a clear proclamation of the gospel in favor of what was really a rival religion of liberalism was a disaster for the faith. The shepherds who wandered into those trackless swamps sadly drew many ordinary people in behind them. I'll go off script for a moment. I remember having a meeting some time ago. I was speaking at a college that I'll leave unnamed, and most of my audience was mainline Protestants, and I spoke on some of my research on the United Church. And one of the gentlemen there, a learned fellow, he was a professor, he talked about how his grandmother had grown up in the United Church, or probably in the Methodist Church before it became the United Church, and had been converted under their ministry and had been animated initially by an evangelical faith. But over the course of the decades, the influence of the United Church gradually led her away from that, to the point that by the end of her life, she had adopted Buddhism. And when speaking about this, it's easy to focus on the leaders and the mistakes made by the leaders, but we have to remember ordinary people followed them. They followed them into this swamp of confusion. On the other hand, we can also say that the collapse of mainline Protestantism has also produced some good side effects. There is today much less cultural Christianity in English Canada, in the sense that there are fewer people who think that they are a Christian because they vaguely remember that their grandmother was an Anglican or a Presbyterian or something. Today, the veneer of inherited Anglican, United, or Presbyterian identity has mostly been peeled away, with the result that such people now think of themselves as simply having no religion. This new situation is much clearer and provides opportunities for people to hear the gospel afresh. The decline of the mainline Protestant churches has also, interestingly, curtailed the influence of liberal Protestant theology, which today is not often found outside of the dwindling mainline Protestant churches, except perhaps in certain corners of the universities. The result is a much sharper and clearer line between belief and unbelief, between Orthodox Christianity and modern paganism. And all of this is good news for those of us who want to proclaim the gospel clearly to our neighbors today. So much for the mixed results of the changes in mainline Protestantism. What about the changes in evangelicalism? First, and most positively, the growth of evangelical churches and ministries outside the mainline meant that there continued to be a strong Orthodox Protestant voice for Jesus, the Bible, and the gospel in Canada, despite the breakdown of the mainline churches. Although this growth was by no means enough to offset numerically the losses of churchgoers from the mainline, God did not leave himself without a faithful witness in this country. And when men and women of evangelical convictions decided to leave the mainline churches, there was a place for them to go where they could hear preaching based on the authority of God's word and be equipped for lives of holiness, witness, and service. The faithfulness of these churches to the gospel meant that the center of gravity of Protestantism in Canada at the end of the century was once again an evangelical one after 100 years or so of liberal ascendancy. The willingness of evangelicals to cooperate in speaking publicly also meant that there was a voice for biblical values in the public square. At the end of the century, evangelicals vied with conservative Catholics for the honor of being the strongest voice for the sanctity of life, freedom of religion and conscience, the educational rights of parents, and the importance of marriage for society. Although the overall trends on each of these issues at the end of the century were not what evangelicals would have hoped, evangelical engagement with them did lead to significant accomplishments, both symbolic results like the inclusion of a reference to God in the preamble to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which I mentioned earlier, as well as practical results like the Supreme Court's ruling in favor of Trinity Western University when the British Columbia College of Teachers tried to shut out its graduates from the school system. However, as I alluded to earlier, this public role was also fraught with temptations. Entering into coalitions and conversations in the halls of power, the need to appear credible, the desire to come across as good citizens and team players, all of these things, again, understandable and even necessary in themselves, made it easier for evangelical leaders to slip into a preoccupation with how they see us. And following from that, an unhealthy tendency to downplay those elements of evangelical teaching and heritage that weren't acceptable in polite circles. At worst, it could lead to a craving for the world's approval and acceptance. Now, such temptations were not equally strong everywhere. They were perhaps felt most keenly by professors in Christian universities, whose graduate school training had socialized them into the rituals and the standards and even the values of the secular academy. Again, we should not be quick to judge, nor do we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Nevertheless, at the end of the 20th century, the pressures, especially on issues of sexuality and gender, were only increasing, and there were unsettling parallels between current-day trends in evangelicalism and the initial rise of liberalism in the mainline churches 130 years earlier. Would evangelicals accept their status as strangers and exiles on the earth? Or would they follow the well-trodden path of respectability, liberalism, and fatal compromise? In short, where was the Canadian church headed as the 21st century dawned? Tomorrow, Dr. Wellham, Principal Wellham, and Dr. Thompson will bring their wisdom to bear on this question. In any case, evangelicals, as Bible people, know that whatever winds will blow, whatever waters we will have to cross, our God is a God who can calm the storms and part the seas. Thank you.